I bought 10 acres of forest with a quiet dream. Then an HOA president decided my trail was hers. She put up signs claiming land she never owned. She blocked my driveway, threatened my kids, called the county. I lost sleep for months fighting a woman who wouldn't stop. 6 months later, everything changed overnight. I found proof she'd forged the deed herself. So I closed the trail and her entire neighborhood paid the price. My name is Mark Sutherland. I'm 42, a structural engineer, married to Priya, father of 2. 11 years ago, we bought 10 wooded acres outside a small town in the Blue Ridge foothills, right beside a new subdivision called Ridgeline Hollow. We wanted quiet, privacy, and room for our kids to grow up outdoors. We got both, along with a neighbor none of us saw coming, and a fight we never asked for. Ridgeline Hollow was built in phases by a developer named Russ Voss. His widow, Deborah Voss, became HOA president after he passed, and she ran that board like it was her personal kingdom, controlling every agenda and outvoting anyone who disagreed. For years we coexisted fine. I let joggers use the old logging trail through my woods as a simple neighborly courtesy. That small courtesy would nearly cost me everything I owned. The trail had been there since before either of us moved in. A packed dirt path cut decades earlier by loggers, winding a mile through my land down to a creek and an overlook the locals called Hawk Ridge. It wasn't on any HOA plat, wasn't fenced, wasn't marked. It wasn't deeded to anyone but me, and I just never bothered restricting it, because back then it genuinely felt harmless. Deborah's husband Russ had verbally told early buyers the trail would always be part of the community. A line realtors repeated for years without anyone ever checking the actual recorded property records against what was actually being promised. I didn't know that offhand promise existed until it became a weapon aimed squarely at me. Verbal promises, I'd eventually learn, mean nothing legally, but they mean everything to angry, invested neighbors. By year 8, Ridgeline Hollow had swelled to 60 homes, and new listings started advertising direct access to scenic Hawk Ridge Trail as a premium selling feature, adding thousands to asking prices without hesitation. Nobody asked me. Quarter. The trail simply became local folklore, repeated so confidently and so often that people genuinely assumed it was permanent. Legitimate HOA property, deeded and guaranteed forever. Deborah started small, the way manipulation always seems to. A friendly note asking if the HOA could help maintain the trail with a gravel path and a few benches. Nothing invasive. I said sure, as long as it stayed a shared courtesy, not a legal claim over my private land. She smiled, thanked me warmly, and left. I didn't realize that pleasant smile was the opening move in a much longer, calculated game. Within a month, HOA-funded signage appeared right at the trailhead. Ridgeline Hollow Community Trail, property of Ridgeline Hollow HOA, bolted permanently into a post at the entrance. No permit from the county. No deed reference. Nothing cleared with me beforehand. I called Deborah immediately. She said it was just wording, and she'd look into fixing it later. Later never came. The sign stayed up all summer, unchallenged. My daughter Ellie, 10 at the time, came home upset because a Ridgeline mom had scolded her for trespassing on HOA land, while walking our own dog on our own private trail behind our house. That was the moment the courtesy stopped feeling like simple courtesy and started feeling like quiet theft. I photographed the sign carefully, printed my recorded deed and formally requested an HOA meeting to address it. At the meeting, Deborah presented the trail as a decades-old community easement, citing her late husband's original sales brochures and vague memories from early residents. I presented my recorded deed showing the trail sat entirely inside my property lines with no easement ever filed anywhere in the county system. The room went quiet. The family said the county records must simply be incomplete or outdated. The board vice president, a soft-spoken retiree named Walt Berman, asked to see the county plat directly, wanting to settle the question with actual documentation rather than dueling memories. Deborah said she'd already checked, and it wasn't necessary right now. Walt looked at me apologetically but didn't push further in front of the room. I left that meeting realizing the board wasn't going to fix this on its own. That night, I called the county clerk's office and requested a certified copy of the original 1987 subdivision plat, wanting something concrete instead of second-hand memory. The clerk mentioned, almost as an aside, that a supplemental amendment had been filed years later referencing a trail easement. I asked who filed it. She said she'd have to dig through the archive room herself and call me back with an answer. I didn't sleep well waiting on that call back, turning the conversation over in my mind again and again. Something about Deborah's calm confidence unsettled me. She wasn't bluffing like someone unsure of their footing. She spoke like she already knew exactly what that supplemental filing said and was betting I'd never bother to check it myself. I decided right then I would check every single page personally. 2 weeks passed with no callback, so I finally drove to the courthouse myself and asked directly. The archive clerk pulled a thin folder labeled Ridgeline Hollow, Amendments. Inside was a photocopied page referencing a trail easement, notarized in 2009, 3 years after Russ Voss had died. The notary's name was smudged, the signature line oddly blank. Something about the whole page felt immediately, unmistakably wrong to me. I asked to see the original, not just the photocopy sitting in that thin folder. The clerk said the original had been checked out for review by a board member 8 months earlier and never actually returned, which was highly irregular for any public record like this. I asked which board member had checked it out. She checked the log, Deborah Voss, HOA president, listed reasons simply as records verification. I drove home with far more questions than answers churning in my head the entire way. Why would Deborah need the physical original document? And why hadn't it been returned to a public archive after 8 full months? I called Walt Berman privately, off the record, and asked if he knew anything about a missing county filing. He went quiet on the phone, then said simply, "Ask her yourself." Mark, my wife Priya, a paralegal by training, suggested we hire a licensed surveyor before things escalated any further, so we'd have our own independent, verified record instead of relying entirely on the county's possibly incomplete archive. I agreed without much hesitation. We scheduled a full boundary survey for the following month, not knowing that simply scheduling it would practically declare open war on Deborah Voss. Word travels fast in a small, tight-knit HOA community. Within days of booking the surveyor, Deborah posted in the community Facebook group about a resident attempting to privatize a beloved shared trail, without naming me directly, but making absolutely sure everyone reading knew exactly who she meant. Comments piled up fast beneath her post, most of them furious, almost none of them actually informed by facts. By the weekend, someone had spray-painted "greedy" across my mailbox in crude red letters. My son Theo found it before I did and asked me, genuinely confused, why our neighbors suddenly hated us so much. I didn't have a good answer ready for a 9-year-old. I reported the vandalism to the sheriff, who filed it as harassment but admitted enforcement in a private easement dispute stayed legally murky. Deborah requested an emergency HOA session the following Tuesday, packed wall to wall with residents holding printed flyers reading, "Save Hawk Ridge Trail," in bold letters. She stood at the front, voice trembling with practiced emotion, describing the trail as her late husband's gift to the community that a newcomer was trying to steal. Nobody in that room mentioned I'd actually lived there 11 years already. I stood to speak and was cut off twice before Walt finally gestured for me to finish my point uninterrupted. I simply asked one direct question. Could anyone in the room produce a recorded easement listing my property as the Servient estate? Silence answered me back. Deborah said the paperwork was being reviewed by county officials and sat back down quickly, avoiding any further follow-up questions from the floor. After the meeting, a woman named Carol Fenn approached me quietly out in the parking lot, glancing around first to see who was watching. She'd bought her home 2 years earlier specifically because the listing advertised guaranteed trail access, paying $11,000 over asking for that one feature alone. She whispered that she didn't fully trust Deborah either, but felt too scared to say so publicly yet. That night Deborah emailed me directly, CCING the entire board members list, demanding I cease and desist any action that would restrict community access to the trail, threatening a formal HOA legal complaint against me. I forwarded it straight to Priya, who read it twice carefully and said, quietly but firmly, she's not defending a trail. She's defending something else entirely. Watch her closely. Mark, the surveyor, a blunt, no-nonsense woman named Renata Kwan, arrived the following week with GPS equipment and old topographic maps tucked under her arm. Within 2 hours, she confirmed what my deed already clearly showed. The entire trailhead to overlook, sat completely inside my recorded property lines, with zero easement notation anywhere in the actual county cadastral database that she could locate at all. Renata flagged one more thing before she packed up and left for the day. The supplemental amendment photocopy I'd found referenced a meets and bounds description that didn't match my property at all. It actually matched a completely different parcel 3 miles away. One Russ Voss had also once owned before selling it off in 2005. Someone, clearly, had spliced 2 different documents together deliberately. I brought this discovery to a real estate attorney, Denise Okafor, who examined both documents side by side under a jeweler's loupe, tilting them under bright light. She confirmed the font kerning on the trail easement paragraph didn't match the rest of the page at all. A telltale sign of a cut-and-paste forgery scanned carefully to look like one continuous original document from 2009. Denise explained that filing a forged easement amendment, if provable in court, constituted both civil fraud and a criminal offense under state recording statutes governing public documents. But proving exactly who submitted it required subpoenaing notary logs and possibly ordering handwriting analysis, which meant lawyers, months of waiting, and real money. I asked her plainly what my simplest legal option was in the meantime while we waited. Denise said plainly, without hesitation, since no valid easement existed anywhere on record, I had every right to restrict access to my own private trail immediately, regardless of the HOA's ongoing internal drama and outrage. I didn't have to wait for a slow fraud investigation to protect my own property rights. That single simple sentence completely reframed the entire fight in my mind going forward. Still, I hesitated for days before acting. Closing the trail meant open, visible war with 60 households. Not just Deborah alone. Priya reminded me that we'd already been vandalized, threatened online repeatedly, and publicly humiliated for simply asking one fair, reasonable question. "You're not starting this war, Mark," she said firmly. "You're just finally deciding not to lose it quietly, without a fight of your own." I ordered a locked gate and professional no trespassing signage, installed properly, referencing my deed book and page number directly on the placard itself so nobody could later claim genuine ignorance. I scheduled the installation for a quiet Saturday morning, expecting some grumbling from neighbors, but nothing remotely close to what actually happened once the crew arrived to start digging the very first post holes. Deborah showed up within 20 minutes of the crew starting work, parking her SUV sideways directly across my driveway entrance to physically block their truck from leaving. She filmed herself on her phone narrating, "A builder illegally sealing off community land," for what I later learned became a viral post shared across 3 different local Facebook groups within hours of her posting it. The installation crew, understandably rattled by the confrontation, paused work entirely until I arrived from inside the house with my deed folder and Renata's official survey report clutched in hand. I calmly explained to Deborah, on camera since she was already filming everything herself, that this was private property. This was a fully legal installation, and she needed to move her vehicle immediately or face consequences. She refused outright, said she'd stand here all day if she had to, and accused me loudly of erasing her husband's legacy in front of the watching crew. I called the sheriff's non-emergency line calmly. 2 deputies arrived 40 minutes later, reviewed my documentation carefully, and asked Deborah to move her vehicle or be formally cited for obstruction. She moved it, glaring the entire time, still filming. That video, edited to conveniently cut out the deputies confirming my clear legal standing, racked up thousands of views with a caption calling me a corporate land grabber destroying nature for profit, despite the fact I'd never sold or developed a single acre of my land in 11 years. The comments underneath grew vicious fast. My employer even received a handful of anonymous complaint emails about me personally. My boss, thankfully, laughed off the strange complaints once I explained the whole absurd situation. But the constant stress bled into everything at home anyway. Theo stopped wanting to ride his bike past the Ridgeline entrance because kids there called him names in passing. Ellie asked quietly if we could just move away instead. I told her firmly we weren't going anywhere. I wasn't entirely sure I believed my own words. The gate went up that evening despite all the chaos surrounding it. Chain locked securely, signage bolted tight, boundary flagged with bright orange survey ribbon every 50 feet along the property line, so there could be absolutely no confusion about where private land legally began. For the first time in months, I felt like I'd actually done something concrete instead of just quietly absorbing every hit. The very next morning, someone cut the heavy chain and left the gate wide open again, along with a fresh spray-painted message on the post reading "Trails are for everyone," in the same red paint. I filed another police report, installed a discreet trail camera facing the gate directly, and reinstalled an even heavier chain rated for far more resistance than simple bolt cutters could handle quickly. 3 nights later the camera caught it clearly. A figure in a dark hoodie at 2 a.m., cutting the new chain with what looked like an angle grinder, sparks lighting up the darkness briefly. The footage was grainy, the face obscured entirely, but the build and the distinctive walk looked eerily, unmistakably like Deborah's adult son, Cody, who still lived with her full-time at home. I sent the footage quietly to the sheriff's department rather than posting it publicly myself, wanting genuine due process instead of another mob response like the one I just barely survived online. The deputy said it wasn't conclusive enough alone for an immediate arrest, but was enough to formally open a vandalism investigation with my property officially listed as the complainant of record. Deborah, somehow, learned about the new investigation almost immediately, faster than any official channel should realistically have allowed for information to travel. I started to suspect someone on the sheriff's civilian staff, or possibly the HOA board itself, was quietly feeding her information from the inside. Small towns run heavily on personal favors and family ties, and Deborah had lived there for over 20 years by then. She called an informational session at the community clubhouse shortly after, standing before a slideshow displaying my locked gate prominently, framing it as clear evidence of a hostile new resident weaponizing private property against a grieving, blameless community. She never once mentioned Cody by name. She never mentioned the forged document either. She simply painted me carefully as the sole villain of her ongoing story. Carol Fenn, the same neighbor from the parking lot earlier, texted me afterward saying half the room had visibly winced at how one-sided the whole presentation felt to her. But nobody spoke up publicly against it. Small communities tend to protect their loudest voice, not necessarily their most honest one. And Deborah had spent 2 full decades making absolutely sure she remained the loudest voice in Ridgeline Hollow. My attorney Denise filed a formal cease and desist letter to the entire HOA board, demanding they retract the false community trail language from all marketing materials, listings, and public Facebook posts immediately, or face a genuine defamation and slander claim alongside the underlying property dispute itself. The board's official response, drafted entirely by Deborah herself, flatly denied any wrongdoing whatsoever on the association's part. Renata, the surveyor, called me back with something entirely new she'd noticed. She'd cross-referenced county tax records and found that 6 separate Ridgeline Hollow homes, all sold within the past 3 years, listed trail access explicitly in their MLS description and closing disclosures, adding an average of $9,000 each to their final sale prices. That single detail would matter enormously to us later on. I asked Renata immediately who the listing agent had been on all 6 of those particular sales. She pulled the public MLS archive and found the exact same name repeated every single time. Deborah Voss, licensed realtor, operating under a small boutique agency she'd personally run since her husband's death, specializing almost exclusively in Ridgeline Hollow properties for years. My stomach genuinely dropped reading that name 6 times over. Deborah wasn't just defending some sentimental memory of her late husband's beloved trail. She was defending an entire ongoing business model built on it. Every home she personally sold with guaranteed trail access commanded a real premium commission on top of an already inflated price, and if that access was ever legally challenged, every prior sale became a potential fraud liability squarely aimed back at her. I mentioned this developing theory to Denise, who cautioned me gently against assuming clear motive without hard proof, but agreed the financial angle explained Deborah's disproportionate aggression far better than sentimentality alone ever could. Grief doesn't usually organize press campaigns and forge documents this precisely and repeatedly. Business self-preservation does. I started looking at every single move she made through that new, sharper lens. A week later, an anonymous letter arrived in my mailbox with no return address, containing a printed screenshot of a text exchange between Deborah and
a local builder named Greg Hutchins discussing clearing the lower trail parcel for 4 new lots, pending resolution of the Sutherland access issue.
I had no idea who sent it, but the implications felt staggering the moment I read it through twice. Deborah wasn't fighting to preserve some beloved community trail at all. She was actively negotiating to have part of that same forested land bulldozed for new development, presumably assuming she could eventually force an easement onto my property and then quietly rezone the adjacent HOA-owned buffer strip nearby. Denise flagged the text screenshot itself as potentially inadmissible without a verified chain of custody, but said it gave us a useful roadmap for a formal discovery request if litigation eventually proceeded further. We needed the real underlying documents, not screenshots from a mystery anonymous source. However tempting it genuinely was to simply believe a helpful tip had fallen into my lap by pure luck alone. I started quietly wondering who could possibly have access to Deborah's private text messages with a builder like that. Her son Cody lived with her full-time. Her daughter Marissa, estranged for years according to persistent neighborhood gossip, occasionally visited on holidays. I filed the anonymous letter away carefully, told nobody outside Priya and Denise about it, and waited patiently to see if more information would eventually surface. Meanwhile, the HOA vandalism investigation stalled out entirely without much explanation. The sheriff's office cited insufficient evidence, despite my clear camera footage, and I later learned, through Carol, that the reviewing deputy was actually married to a woman on Deborah's HOA social committee. Small-town connections had quietly, effectively strangled my legitimate case before it ever reached a proper courtroom setting at all. Frustrated by the stall, I requested my own independent forensic video specialist review the footage separately and more thoroughly. He enhanced the frames enough to identify a distinctive scar on the hoodied figure's forearm, visible briefly under harsh camera infrared lighting at night. It matched a skateboarding injury Cody Voss had posted about publicly on Instagram 2 summers earlier. Scar and all. Unmistakably, I brought this fresh evidence straight to Denise, who said it strengthened a civil vandalism claim considerably, even if the criminal charges stayed locally stalled for now. We filed a civil suit against Cody Voss for property damage, entirely separate from the ongoing trail dispute itself, hoping it would finally force Deborah to genuinely negotiate instead of escalate further. It did precisely the opposite instead. Deborah reacted to the lawsuit by launching what she publicly called a community defense fund, soliciting donations from HOA members to cover her son's mounting legal fees, framing the entire situation as one entitled outsider attacking a beloved local family unfairly. Nearly $4,000 poured in within a single week from neighbors who barely even knew either one of us personally. Walt Berman, visibly uncomfortable with all of it now, quietly resigned from the HOA board citing vague personal reasons, but told me privately over coffee that he simply couldn't keep sitting through meetings where basic facts got twisted so thoroughly, so repeatedly. He mentioned, almost in passing, that Deborah had once shown him board copies of documents that didn't actually match the official county filings at all. That single comment stuck with me for days afterward. I asked Walt if he'd be willing to give a sworn formal statement about discrepancies he'd personally witnessed in HOA paperwork over the years. He hesitated, worried genuinely about backlash in a community he still had to live within, but eventually agreed, saying quietly, "Someone should have stopped her years ago. Honestly, long before any of this." Denise took Walt's statement formally and carefully, establishing a documented pattern of Deborah controlling, altering, or withholding HOA documents going back at least 6 full years, well before our current dispute had even begun in earnest. This wasn't some isolated conflict over one single trail. This was a documented pattern of one woman manipulating an entire community's paper trail methodically for years on end. With Walt's sworn statement now firmly in hand, Denise filed a motion demanding the HOA board produce its complete original meeting minutes and financial records for the past full decade, arguing clear relevance to both the ongoing fraud and vandalism claims already filed. Deborah, now acting HOA president and de facto record custodian, had 30 days to fully comply or face contempt sanctions from the court. The 30 days passed with only partial, heavily redacted records surfacing, missing entire sections Walt swore had definitely existed, including financial disclosures about a trail maintenance fund residents had quietly been paying into for years, ostensibly for gravel and benches, though no invoices for any actual maintenance work ever appeared anywhere in the produced paperwork whatsoever, redacted or otherwise. Carol Fenn, still texting me regular updates from inside the community, mentioned she'd personally paid into that same maintenance fund for 2 full years, as part of her HOA dues without ever once seeing a receipt or an itemized expense report, something she'd genuinely never questioned until right now. She wasn't the only resident starting to ask increasingly uncomfortable questions about where that money actually went. A financial forensic accountant hired by Denise traced roughly $22,000 collected under trail maintenance over 4 years, with almost no corresponding expenditure records anywhere, no contractor invoices, no material receipts of any kind. The money had simply moved quietly into a general HOA operating account Deborah personally controlled signing authority over as both president and treasurer combined. Unusually and without oversight, this was no longer just a simple property line dispute anymore. This was potential embezzlement layered directly on top of a forged easement, layered further on top of harassment, vandalism, and slander already documented. Denise said we now had enough documented pattern to seriously consider not just civil litigation but a formal referral to the State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division as well. Before filing that formal referral, Denise insisted we needed the original forged document itself, not just photocopies, to nail down provable criminal fraud with physical evidence a prosecutor could actually use effectively in court. The original document was still officially missing from the county archive, checked out 8 months earlier and never returned, according to that clerk's log I'd already seen once before. I drove back to the courthouse and asked the clerk directly whether Deborah had ever actually returned the original document at any point. She checked her records, hesitated visibly, then admitted quietly that she wasn't really supposed to say this. But the original had actually been returned 3 weeks earlier, heavily water damaged, several key lines completely illegible, as if deliberately, carefully ruined by someone. I asked to see it anyway, damage or no damage. Even badly damaged, forensic document examiners could sometimes still recover ink layering, indentation patterns, and paper fiber inconsistencies entirely invisible to the naked eye alone. Denise arranged for an independent forensic document examiner, Dr. Alina Petrov, to formally request access to the damaged original under a strict preservation order before anyone else could touch it further.
DR. Preliminary report. Delivered 3 long weeks later. Confirmed exactly what the font kerning had already visually suggested from the start. The trail easement paragraph was a completely separate print job, on slightly different paper stock, adhered and rescanned carefully to mimic a single continuous 2009 filing. It was, in her professional expert opinion, conclusively and deliberately fabricated beyond any reasonable doubt.
With DR now finalized, Denise filed the referral to the State Attorney General alongside our existing civil suit, formally naming Deborah Voss for document fraud, potential embezzlement of HOA maintenance funds, and civil harassment tied directly to the vandalism and defamation campaign against us. The state investigator assigned to the case requested a full initial meeting with us within 2 weeks. Deborah, apparently sensing the tide finally shifting against her, escalated instead of retreating quietly.
She began circulating a formal petition demanding the county condemn my land through eminent domain for public trail access. Gathering signatures door to door personally.
Eminent domain for a private recreational trail benefiting one HOA's home values was, according to Denise, an almost laughably weak legal theory on its own merits. But weak theories still cost real time and money to formally defeat in court proceedings. Deborah knew this well already. She wasn't trying to actually win the argument. She was trying to bury me under mounting legal fees until I simply gave up entirely. I started keeping a careful spreadsheet of every single dollar this exhausting fight had cost us so far: survey fees, forensic examiner fees, attorney retainers, camera equipment, gate installation, replacement chains repeatedly. We'd already crossed $31,000 in just 8 months defending land we already legally owned outright the whole time. Priya suggested we start a modest legal defense fund of our own quietly, through family only. Then Marissa Voss, Deborah's estranged daughter, reached out to me directly through a private message online, something I never remotely expected to happen. She said she'd been watching the situation unfold online from out of state and had information her mother wouldn't want made public. I forwarded the message to Denise immediately, cautious but genuinely hopeful for the first time in many exhausting months. Denise arranged a recorded phone call with Marissa shortly after, who explained she'd cut all contact with her mother 5 years earlier after discovering Deborah had forged her late father's signature on a separate property transfer document entirely unrelated to our current case. Something Marissa had reported to a lawyer back then, but never fully pursued out of lingering family guilt and loyalty. Marissa also confirmed something absolutely crucial to our case. Her mother had personally handled all of Russ Voss's original paperwork after his death, including notarizing several documents herself despite not being a licensed notary at that specific time, using an old stamp she'd apparently kept from a previous administrative job years earlier. That single detail alone potentially explained the smudged, questionable notary seal we'd already found. This was our 6th and final confirmed piece of the puzzle: motive, method, opportunity, and now a well-documented history of prior forgery within Deborah's own family, corroborated directly by her own daughter under recorded sworn testimony. Denise said this transformed our entire case from strong to nearly airtight, provided Marissa remained willing to testify formally in court if it eventually came down to trial. Marissa agreed without hesitation, saying quietly on the recording, "I watched her control everything my whole life. My dad's memory, the HOA, our entire family. Somebody needs to finally tell the truth about her, and I'm tired of being scared of what she'll say about me publicly if I do." Her voice cracked slightly toward the end. I believed every single word she said. With Marissa's formal statement now secured, Denise scheduled formal depositions for Deborah, Cody, and the HOA's records custodian, giving Deborah a full 30 days notice before compelled testimony under oath, where lying about any of this would carry serious criminal perjury exposure on top of everything else already stacking up against her steadily. The clock was now officially, undeniably running against her. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, I felt something genuinely shift from constant dread to cautious, guarded hope. We had documents, a solid forensic report, sworn statements, a clear paper trail of missing funds, and now a family insider corroborating a long pattern of deception. Deborah still didn't know how much evidence we already had. That quiet silence felt, briefly, like real peace. Life at home almost normalized for a few precious weeks after that. Theo rode his bike again freely, avoiding only the ridgeline entrance but otherwise genuinely happy. Ellie stopped asking about moving away entirely. Priya and I actually slept through a few full nights without rehashing every single legal detail before bed. We knew the deposition date was still coming, but for now, we simply breathed easier. Carol Fenn invited us to a small barbecue outside the official HOA events calendar, hosted by neighbors who'd quietly grown skeptical of Deborah's leadership over the maintenance fund questions alone. It was the first time in nearly a year I felt like part of a real community instead of its designated public villain, even if it was still a small, cautious, tentative gathering of doubters. At that barbecue, 3 separate homeowners privately admitted they'd never actually seen an itemized invoice for trail maintenance despite paying into the fund for years without complaint. And 2 mentioned Deborah had actively discouraged them from asking too many questions at board meetings, redirecting conversations smoothly whenever finances came up unexpectedly. Doubt was finally spreading well beyond just Carol and Walt alone now. Deborah, sensing her grip on the community loosening, called an emergency all-members HOA meeting, standing before the largest crowd I'd seen yet gathered, announcing she was temporarily stepping back from board finances pending an internal review, while insisting the trail dispute remained entirely separate and unrelated. Nobody in the room seemed fully convinced anymore. Something had visibly cracked in public that night. A local news reporter, an old college friend of Priya's, caught wind of the eminent domain petition and reached out for comment, having noticed the unusual pairing of a county land grab attempt alongside a quietly circulating HOA financial review happening simultaneously. I declined an on-record interview per Denise's careful advice, but confirmed litigation was ongoing without offering any further specific details. The reporter, undeterred by my silence, filed a public records request with the county for the eminent domain petition itself, discovering it had never actually been formally submitted to the county board at all, only circulated informally within Ridgeline Hollow to gather signatures and apply pressure, never genuinely intended for real legal filing whatsoever. It was theater, not actual law, and residents deserved to know that. That revelation, once it reached Carol's barbecue group chat, spread through the neighborhood faster than any of Deborah's own Facebook posts ever had before. Residents who'd signed the petition believing it was a genuine legal effort felt manipulated and used, having handed over personal information and public support for something that existed only to intimidate one stubborn neighbor into surrendering quietly and without a fight. Deborah tried damage control quickly, claiming the petition was still in early stages and blaming confusing county bureaucracy for the obvious discrepancy. But her explanations grew visibly thinner and less convincing each time she repeated them. Even loyal longtime supporters started asking harder, more pointed questions in the community group now. Questions Deborah had successfully deflected for years through pure confidence and sheer social volume alone. Meanwhile, Dr. Petrov's forensic report went fully final. Formally concluding the trail easement document was assembled from two separate print sources on two entirely different paper stocks, digitally merged and rescanned carefully to simulate one continuous original page. Dated with a notary stamp inconsistent with any registered notary commission active in the county that specific year at all. Denise forwarded the finalized forensic report directly to the state attorney general's investigator, who scheduled an in-person interview with Deborah within the month, entirely separate from our ongoing civil case. Criminal exposure was now genuinely real, not merely theoretical anymore, and word of a state investigator's active involvement traveled through Ridgeline Hollow almost as fast as Deborah's own gossip once reliably had. I received an unexpected phone call from Greg Hutchins, the builder mentioned in that earlier anonymous text screenshot, who wanted to clear the air honestly before things went any further between us. He admitted Deborah had approached him 18 months earlier about developing the lower trail parcel, contingent on quietly securing an easement through my property first, a plan he'd since walked away from entirely. Greg agreed to provide a written statement confirming those private development conversations, motivated partly by wanting to protect his own business reputation once he realized Deborah's underlying paperwork was fraudulent all along. His statement gave Denise direct confirmation of clear financial motive. Deborah wasn't genuinely preserving heritage. She was actively clearing a path toward a lucrative private development deal for herself. With Greg's statement now added to Marissa's, Walt's, Dr. Petrov's forensic report, and the financial forensic accountant's $22,000 maintenance fund gap, Denise said our case file had grown into what she called a genuinely comprehensive pattern of fraud, motive, and concealment rarely seen documented this clearly in a private HOA dispute of this particular size and scope. Deborah, apparently unaware of exactly how much evidence had accumulated steadily against her, doubled down publicly instead of quietly negotiating a favorable settlement while she still had some leverage left. She posted a lengthy statement accusing me of colluding with a bitter estranged daughter and a disgruntled ex-board member purely to destroy her reputation out of personal spite alone. That post backfired immediately and spectacularly. Marissa, seeing herself publicly attacked by her own mother online in front of everyone, responded from her personal account with a single pointed line. Ask her about the notary stamp. Mom, you know exactly which one I mean. She didn't explain further, but the comment section exploded instantly with confused, curious, increasingly suspicious neighbors demanding answers. Deborah deleted the post within the hour, but not before dozens of screenshots had already circulated through every Ridgeline Hollow group chat, including Carol's own. The community that had once rallied so fiercely behind her now buzzed openly with speculation about notary stamps, missing funds, and a daughter who clearly knew something the rest of the neighborhood didn't yet understand. Sensing the ground finally shifting beneath her, Deborah requested a private meeting with me directly. No lawyers present. Just the two of us alone. At a coffee shop outside the subdivision. Denise advised strongly against it without counsel present, but agreed to let me go ahead if I recorded the entire conversation openly and disclosed that fact to Deborah immediately upon arrival. Deborah arrived looking noticeably less composed than I'd ever seen her before, hands wrapped tightly around her coffee cup nervously. She opened by offering to quietly withdraw all HOA claims to the trail if I agreed to drop the fraud referral and vandalism suit entirely, framing it as putting this whole unfortunate misunderstanding behind us both. Finally and quietly, I told her plainly that this had stopped being about a simple trail months ago already, and that a state investigator was already fully involved regardless of anything either of us agreed to privately now. Her composure cracked slightly at that, and for one unguarded moment, she said quietly, "I did everything for this community. Everything." Falling apart around me completely. I asked her directly about the notary stamp Marissa had mentioned publicly online. She went visibly pale, set her coffee cup down slowly, and said only, "That's a family matter, not yours to bring up here," before standing abruptly and leaving without finishing her sentence, or her coffee. That single reaction told me more than any forensic report ever possibly could have. I sent the recording straight to Denise that same afternoon.
She said Deborah's offer to withdraw all claims if I dropped the fraud referral was itself potentially relevant as evidence of consciousness of guilt.
And 2 days later, Cody Voss was arrested on the vandalism charge after the enhanced camera footage, combined with his own public Instagram scar photo, gave the sheriff's department enough independent evidence to finally act despite whatever internal connections had quietly stalled things previously. Deborah reportedly showed up at the station demanding his immediate, unconditional release, with Cody now facing formal criminal charges. Deborah's public narrative of victimhood grew considerably harder to sustain credibly. Local news, having already confirmed the fake eminent domain petition, ran a short segment on HOA disputes turning criminal in Ridgeline Hollow, carefully avoiding naming anyone directly but describing details unmistakably matching our exact situation to anyone paying close attention locally. The segment triggered a wave of new HOA members requesting the full financial records Deborah had previously stonewalled for months, citing their basic legal right as dues-paying members to review association finances properly. Facing mounting internal pressure alongside external legal exposure now, Deborah finally produced a partial accounting, still noticeably incomplete, still missing years of maintenance fund invoices entirely. Walt, now formally a witness in our growing case, quietly encouraged several longtime residents to request an independent forensic audit of the entire HOA's finances going back a full decade, not just the maintenance fund alone, arguing that if one fund had irregularities, others likely did too. The board, without Deborah's usual dominant presence at meetings, actually finally agreed to the audit. The independent audit, once formally approved by the board, would take roughly 2 months to complete properly, during which Deborah remained HOA president in name only, increasingly sidelined from real decisions as other board members grew emboldened by mounting evidence of her deception. Her once unshakable control over the community was crumbling steadily, piece by piece, in full public view. Then, unexpectedly, A second forged document surfaced entirely. Marissa, digging through old family storage boxes at her mother's own request years earlier for an unrelated matter, had photographed several pages, just in case, including an early handwritten draft of the same easement language. Notes in Deborah's own handwriting practicing the exact wording before it was ever formally typed up. Marissa forwarded these photographs directly to Denise, who had Dr. Petrov compare the handwriting against known samples of Deborah's writing from HOA meeting minutes she'd personally authored over the years. The forensic match was, in Dr. Petrov's professional words, consistent beyond reasonable dispute. Deborah hadn't just used a forged document. She'd drafted the entire thing herself, personally, from scratch. This discovery transformed the state attorney general investigator's posture toward the case entirely and immediately. What had started as a simple document fraud inquiry now looked increasingly like a prosecutable felony forgery case, with a documented draft in the suspect's own handwriting, a family insider's testimony, and forensic confirmation all converging on the exact same conclusion within a matter of just weeks. Deborah, perhaps sensing the walls closing in faster than she'd anticipated, escalated in a direction none of us had expected at all. She began quietly reaching out to individual Ridgeline Hollow homeowners, offering to personally cover any legal costs if they publicly denounced Marissa as an unstable, vindictive daughter fabricating stories out of resentment toward her own mother. Carol was one of the residents Deborah personally approached with this offer. She declined immediately, then texted me a screenshot of the entire offer, disturbed by how calculated and financially generous it was for someone supposedly facing an internal financial audit for missing funds already. Where's she getting this money if the HOA account is already short $22,000? Carol asked me pointedly. That exact question led Denise to formally request bank records as part of discovery proceedings, revealing Deborah had transferred nearly $8,000 from the HOA operating account into a personal account labeled simply Reserve Fund Transfer, unauthorized by any actual board vote on record, just 3 weeks after our civil suit against Cody was first filed publicly against him. This unauthorized transfer, discovered mid-litigation, gave Denise solid grounds to seek an emergency asset freeze on Deborah's personal accounts to prevent further dissipation of potentially embezzled community funds, while the case proceeded further. The judge granted a temporary restraining order within days, freezing roughly $30,000 total across Deborah's personal and business accounts combined immediately. Deborah's own real estate brokerage, entirely dependent on steady cash flow for marketing and staging costs on her active Ridgeline Hollow listings, was hit hard by the freeze almost immediately and painfully. 2 pending sales, both listed with trail access language still uncorrected despite the ongoing litigation, stalled completely as buyers' agents grew increasingly nervous about the unresolved legal dispute hanging over everything. One buyer, mid-contract on a $600,000 Ridgeline Hollow home purchase, formally requested written disclosure clarifying the trail access controversy before closing, per their own attorney's cautious advice. Deborah's brokerage had no truthful way left to answer that specific question anymore without admitting the access was legally disputed, forged, and potentially permanently closed by court order soon. That buyer, understandably spooked by the ambiguity, withdrew from the contract entirely rather than risk closing on a home whose advertised premium amenity might legally vanish within months of purchase. The seller, furious at losing a solid buyer over what they called some ridiculous neighbor drama, publicly blamed Deborah's brokerage for failing to disclose the known litigation risk properly and honestly. Word of the collapse sale spread through Ridgeline Hollow within a single day. And suddenly the abstract legal fight I'd been quietly waging for nearly a year became something every homeowner could immediately understand in cold, hard dollars and cents. Their own home values were directly, measurably tied to a trail claim that increasingly looked completely fraudulent from top to bottom. 3 more sellers with pending listings contacted Deborah's brokerage demanding immediate clarification on the matter, threatening to switch agents entirely if she couldn't guarantee accurate, legally sound disclosure language moving forward. Deborah, cornered financially and professionally now, finally agreed through her attorney to have the HOA formally retract all guaranteed trail access language from every current listing immediately and completely. That formal retraction, filed quietly with the local MLS board, effectively confirmed publicly what Denise's entire case had argued privately for months already. The trail access was never legally guaranteed, never properly recorded anywhere, and never something Deborah had any legitimate authority whatsoever to promise buyers in the first place. It was, essentially, a public admission of the underlying fraud itself. Once that retraction became visible in the public MLS transaction history, several previous buyers, including Carol Fenn herself, realized they'd overpaid specifically for a feature that legally never existed as advertised to them. Carol consulted her own attorney about potential recourse against Deborah's brokerage for the sizable premium she'd paid 2 years earlier based on that exact same false promise. Carol's attorney identified 4 other prior sales with strikingly similar trail access language in their listings, all handled personally by Deborah, all commanding similar unexplained premiums over comparable homes lacking that feature. A clear pattern of consistent, repeated misrepresentation across multiple transactions started forming steadily, potentially exposing Deborah to real estate licensing sanctions on a much broader statewide scale. The State Real Estate Commission, once notified informally by Carol's attorney, opened its own separate inquiry into Deborah's licensing conduct, entirely independent of both the criminal forgery investigation and our ongoing civil litigation. Deborah was now facing simultaneous exposure on 3 separate fronts at once: criminal fraud, civil liability, and professional licensing revocation, all stemming from one single forged trail claim. Priya pointed out something almost poetic about the whole unraveling situation. Deborah had spent years inflating home values in Ridgeline Hollow using a lie about my own land, and now that same lie, once fully exposed, was actively deflating those same home values in real time, as buyers and sellers alike scrambled to distance themselves quickly from the growing fallout. I felt no particular satisfaction watching neighbors' home values dip lower, since most of them had simply trusted a system they had no real reason to doubt at the time. My anger stayed focused entirely on Deborah, who'd built years of profit and reputation on a document she'd personally forged, then weaponized her entire community to defend it aggressively against me alone. Denise scheduled Deborah's formal deposition for the following week. Now armed with the handwriting match, the bank transfer records, the MLS retraction, Marissa's testimony, Walt's statement, Greg's development disclosure, and Dr. Petrov's finalized forensic report. It was, by any reasonable measure, an overwhelming amount of corroborated evidence pointing steadily in exactly one clear direction. The night before the deposition, I couldn't sleep at all, running through every possible way Deborah might try to spin or deflect under oath the next day. Priya reminded me calmly that regardless of how the deposition actually went, We already had more than enough independently verified evidence to prove our case fully in court, with or without her direct cooperation. Deborah arrived at the deposition with a brand new attorney, having apparently fired her previous one recently, looking noticeably thinner and visibly exhausted compared to the confident, composed woman who'd once stood before packed HOA meetings controlling every narrative in the room effortlessly. The transformation over just a few months was genuinely, quietly striking to witness firsthand. Under oath, when shown the handwriting comparison between her own meeting minutes and the draft easement language, Deborah initially claimed she didn't recognize the handwriting at all. Then, faced with Dr. Petrov's detailed methodology explanation, requested a break with her attorney that lasted nearly 40 full minutes before the deposition finally resumed at all that afternoon. When it resumed, Deborah's attorney announced she would be invoking her right against self-incrimination for any further questions related to the document's original origin. A move Denise noted for the record as significant given the civil nature of our proceeding, since invoking the fifth typically signals genuine criminal exposure concerns to any watching judge or jury. The deposition continued regarding the financial questions instead, where Deborah claimed the unauthorized $8,000 transfer was actually a personal loan repayment for money she'd previously advanced to the HOA during a cash flow shortage. Though she couldn't produce any documentation of the original loan when Denise requested supporting records right there on the spot. Denise pressed further on the maintenance fund's $22,000 gap directly, and Deborah claimed vague memories of cash payments to a handyman without a name, invoice, receipt, or any verifiable record whatsoever to support the claim. Denise characterized this explanation afterward as the weakest, least credible answer I've heard in 15 years of practicing this particular kind of litigation professionally. By the end of the 6-hour deposition, Deborah had invoked her right against self-incrimination 11 separate times throughout, offered financial explanations with zero supporting documentation at all, and repeatedly contradicted details from her own earlier sworn HOA meeting statements regarding when and how the trail easement document was supposedly discovered in the county archives originally. Denise called it, plainly and without exaggeration, one of the most self-defeating depositions I've ever personally witnessed, predicting it would significantly strengthen our position heading into any settlement negotiation or eventual full trial. I felt something close to genuine relief for the first time in nearly a full year, though Priya reminded me the fight wasn't fully over just yet. 2 weeks after the deposition concluded, the State Attorney General's office formally filed criminal forgery charges against Deborah Voss, citing the fabricated 2009 easement amendment directly, the handwriting match to her own drafting notes, and the improper use of an expired notary stamp she had no legal authority whatsoever to use at that specific time. Local news, no longer avoiding names now that formal charges were officially public record, ran a full segment identifying Deborah by name clearly, detailing the forged trail easement, the frozen assets, the collapsed home sale, and the broader HOA financial irregularities under independent audit currently. Ridgeline Hollow's once quiet neighborhood drama became regional news practically overnight. The independent financial audit, completed shortly afterward, confirmed not just the previously known $22,000 maintenance fund gap, but an additional $11,000 in questionable administrative expense reimbursements Deborah had approved for herself over 6 years without any secondary board sign-off required by the HOA's own bylaws, which she'd apparently never enforced consistently against herself. Facing criminal charges, a state licensing investigation, an unfavorable audit, and mounting civil liability across multiple prior home sales. Deborah resigned as HOA president in a brief, terse email sent to the entire board, offering no apology whatsoever, no explanation, simply citing personal health reasons as her official stated cause for immediate departure from the role. Walt, despite everything that had happened, felt a flicker of genuine sympathy watching someone he'd known for 2 decades collapse so completely and publicly, though he admitted to me over coffee that sympathy didn't erase the years of manipulation, the missing funds, or the forged documents that had started this entire cascade of consequences in the first place. Unavoidably, with Deborah gone from HOA leadership entirely now, the board, temporarily led by Carol Fenn as interim president, voted unanimously to formally acknowledge my sole legal ownership of the trail, retract every remaining reference to it in HOA materials, and issue a public apology for the vandalism, harassment, and false claims made against my family over the preceding year. Carol personally called me to deliver that apology in person, admitting she felt partly responsible for not questioning Deborah's authority sooner, given how many small red flags she'd personally noticed over the years but dismissed simply as Deborah being intense, rather than recognizing a genuine, deliberate pattern of manipulation and fraud unfolding in plain sight all along. I told Carol honestly I didn't blame ordinary residents for trusting a community leader who'd spent 2 decades cultivating exactly that trust deliberately and skillfully over time. The fault sat entirely with Deborah, who'd exploited that hard-earned trust methodically for personal financial gain, not with neighbors who simply believed what their HOA president repeatedly, confidently told them was true. The criminal case moved steadily toward trial over the following months, with Marissa, Walt, Greg Hutchins, Dr. Petrov, and the forensic accountant all confirmed as witnesses, alongside Renata's original survey and my own personal testimony establishing the initial timeline clearly. Deborah's attorney, reading the overwhelming evidence stacked against her, began quietly signaling openness to a negotiated plea agreement instead of trial. Denise, coordinating closely with the state prosecutor, indicated our civil case would likely settle once the criminal matter fully resolved, since Deborah's remaining frozen assets and declining brokerage income left limited practical recovery available regardless of how aggressively we pursued additional civil damages beyond what was already legally secured through the existing asset freeze in place. Priya and I discussed at length what winning even truly meant at this point in the ordeal. We never wanted Deborah's total downfall specifically. We'd simply wanted the harassment to stop, the trail respected as legally ours, and accountability for the forged document and stolen funds. Watching her entire carefully built empire collapse felt less like triumph and more like an inevitable consequence finally arriving. Still, some quiet satisfaction was undeniable underneath everything. The gate stood locked and undisputed now. Finally, the camera hadn't caught a single trespasser in months. Theo rode past the Ridgeline entrance again without a single incident. Ellie stopped asking if we'd have to move away. Slowly, quietly, our life started genuinely resembling the peaceful one we'd originally bought this land for. Then, 3 weeks before her scheduled plea hearing, Deborah did something none of us anticipated at all. She showed up unannounced at my property gate at dawn, entirely alone. No cameras, no lawyer, no prepared statement of any kind. standing quietly at the locked chain like she genuinely still believed she had some remaining claim to walk through it freely. My trail camera caught her standing there nearly 20 full minutes, just staring silently at the locked gate, before finally turning and walking slowly back toward her car. I watched the footage later that same morning, unsettled by how small and defeated she looked now compared to the commanding, confident woman who'd once blocked a work cruise truck without any hesitation whatsoever. I debated calling the sheriff for a simple trespassing report right then, but ultimately decided against it, feeling this quiet, wordless visit was less a genuine threat and more some kind of private reckoning she needed to have entirely alone, away from lawyers and cameras and community audiences, with the land she'd once tried so desperately hard to claim as her own. 2 days later, Cody Voss accepted a plea deal on the vandalism charge, receiving probation, mandatory restitution for the damaged gate and chain, and community service hours, a resolution Denise called appropriately proportional, given his relatively young age and the clear fact he'd acted, at least partly, under his mother's direct influence and active encouragement throughout. With Cody's case now fully resolved, all remaining pressure concentrated entirely on Deborah's upcoming criminal forgery trial, now just weeks away, alongside the parallel state licensing investigation, threatening her real estate career permanently, and the collapsing civil landscape as more former buyers quietly explored their own potential fraud claims against her brokerage's past documented conduct. Then, in what Denise called an almost desperate final move, Deborah's attorney filed a last-minute motion attempting to argue the entire forged document dispute was moot, since the HOA itself had already voluntarily retracted the trail access language months earlier, essentially arguing there was no ongoing harm left to prosecute or litigate further at all. The judge rejected that motion within days, noting plainly and firmly that voluntary retraction after full public exposure didn't erase prior criminal forgery, years of fraudulent home sale premiums, or misappropriated community funds that predated any retraction whatsoever. The financial and reputational damage had already occurred well before Deborah ever admitted any wrongdoing publicly or even privately to anyone. Facing that firmly rejected motion, Deborah's attorney formally requested a plea negotiation meeting with the state prosecutor, hoping to secure reduced charges in exchange for full cooperation, restitution to affected homeowners, and a public admission of the document's fabrication, something Denise said would significantly strengthen our remaining civil claims considerably if it actually happened. The prosecutor agreed to negotiate, primarily because a public guilty plea with detailed admission would spare taxpayers a lengthy, costly trial while still delivering meaningful accountability, restitution, and a permanent criminal record reflecting the actual severity of what Deborah had done to both my family and her own trusting, deceived community members over the years. 3 days before the scheduled plea hearing, local news obtained and published the full forensic report detailing exactly how the document had been fabricated from scratch. The handwriting matched to Deborah's own drafting notes, and the pattern of 6 inflated home sales tied directly to her false trail access claims over multiple years running. That published report finally gave the remaining skeptical Ridgeline Hollow residents, the ones who'd still quietly defended Deborah out of decades-long personal loyalty, undeniable proof they could no longer rationalize away easily. Even her most stubborn remaining supporters in the community Facebook group grew noticeably silent once the full forensic details became public record for everyone to see. At the plea hearing itself, Deborah formally pleaded guilty to felony document forgery and misdemeanor misappropriation of association funds, receiving a sentence of 18 months probation, a permanent felony record, mandatory restitution of $33,000 combined to the HOA and affected homeowners, and a formal admission read aloud clearly in open court for the record. Standing in that courtroom, hearing Deborah admit under oath that she'd personally drafted and fabricated the trail easement document to protect her real estate commissions and her late husband's inflated legacy, felt like the closing of a chapter I'd spent nearly a full year fighting through exhausting uncertainty, public humiliation, and genuine fear for my family. Marissa attended the hearing quietly from the back row of the courtroom, not speaking to her mother directly, not making eye contact even once, simply present as a witness to an accountability she'd waited years to finally see arrive. Afterward, she told me privately that she finally felt able to breathe freely for the first time in over a decade of her life. The State Real Estate Commission, citing the criminal conviction alongside its own independent licensing investigation findings, formally revoked Deborah's real estate license permanently and completely, ending her brokerage entirely and closing the door on any future ability to profit from Ridgeline Hollow property sales the way she'd operated for nearly 2 decades previously without any real oversight. With Deborah's brokerage now closed for good, her remaining active listings transferred over to other local agents, who were legally required to correct the trail access disclosures immediately upon taking them on, formally confirming for every buyer and seller involved that the amenity long advertised as a premium feature simply never legally existed the way it had once been marketed to them. Real estate appraisers, once the litigation and criminal conviction became public record for everyone, began systematically adjusting comparable sale values for Ridgeline Hollow properties, removing the artificial premium tied to falsely advertised trail access from every relevant historical transaction used in future appraisals throughout the subdivision going forward indefinitely from that point on. An independent appraisal firm, hired collectively by concerned Ridgeline Hollow homeowners themselves, estimated the average home in the subdivision had lost approximately $8,000 in appraised value once the trail access premium was formally stripped from comparable sales data used, a modest but very real and measurable financial consequence rippling through the whole neighborhood. For homes specifically marketed with explicit guaranteed trail access language in their original listings, the impact was significantly steeper across the board, with several properties losing between $12,000 and $18,000 in reappraised value once buyers and future appraisers understood that amenity had been fraudulently promised and was now permanently, legally unavailable to any current or future resident whatsoever. Carol's home alone lost roughly $14,000 in reappraised value, on top of the $11,000 she'd already overpaid at purchase specifically for that same false amenity years earlier. A painful $25,000 combined financial hit she attributed entirely and directly to Deborah's forged claims over the exact same forested trail I owned outright the entire time. Across the 6 homes Deborah had personally sold using explicit trail access language in their listings, combined reappraisal losses and original purchase premiums totaled just over $50,000 in documented, measurable financial harm to those 6 households alone, a figure Denise later cited directly in our final civil settlement negotiations against Deborah's remaining frozen assets. That $50,000 figure, once confirmed through the independent appraisal firm's formal detailed report, became impossible for Deborah's legal team to dispute credibly at all, given it was calculated using standard, widely accepted real estate appraisal methodology rather than speculative estimates from any party with an obvious personal stake in the final outcome of the case. Several affected homeowners, including Carol, filed a coordinated civil claim against Deborah's now shuttered brokerage, seeking recovery for both original overpayment and subsequent reappraisal losses tied directly to her documented, admitted fraud on the record. Deborah's remaining frozen assets, roughly $30,000 total, became the primary target of competing claims from multiple directions simultaneously. Denise negotiated our own civil settlement to prioritize restitution toward the homeowners directly harmed by the fraudulent sales premium, since our own family's actual financial damages, while genuinely real and significant, were dwarfed by the collective $50,000 hit absorbed by neighbors who'd simply trusted their HOA president's false representations in good faith the whole time. I told Denise plainly I wanted our settlement structured that way deliberately and without hesitation. We'd already recovered our dignity, our legal standing, and our undisputed trail ownership through the criminal conviction itself entirely. The remaining limited funds, I felt strongly, belonged first to neighbors who'd unknowingly paid real money for a lie Deborah had personally fabricated and profited from directly. Priya agreed completely with that decision, though she noted with quiet irony that the very homeowners who'd once vandalized our mailbox, blocked our driveway installation, and believed Deborah's public narrative against us without question were now the primary beneficiaries of our decision to prioritize their recovery over our own remaining civil damages claim entirely. That's not really irony, Priya said thoughtfully after a moment. That's just what actually doing the right thing looks like in practice. They were manipulated too, just differently than we were, but still genuinely manipulated. I found myself agreeing with her completely, even after everything Ridgeline Hollow's residents had put us through during Deborah's carefully orchestrated public campaign against our entire family. The settlement, once finalized officially, distributed roughly $22,000 across the 6 most severely affected homeowners, prioritized by documented financial harm suffered, with our own family receiving a smaller portion covering our direct litigation costs alongside a formal, legally binding, permanent recognition of our exclusive private ownership over the entire disputed trail property once and for all. That legal recognition mattered more to me personally than any dollar figure ever possibly could. The trail, the creek, the overlook at Hawk Ridge, all of it, formally and permanently confirmed as mine alone, with a court-ordered injunction permanently barring the HOA or any future board from ever claiming access, easement, or ownership rights over it again in the future. With the settlement now finalized, Carol organized one final community gathering, not an official HOA meeting exactly, more an informal neighborhood dinner really, inviting my family specifically as guests of honor. A small but deeply meaningful gesture from residents who'd once believed the absolute worst about us based entirely on one woman's carefully constructed false narrative all along. At that dinner, several neighbors apologized directly and sincerely, admitting they'd repeated Deborah's claims without ever checking a single fact themselves, simply trusting a familiar community leader's confident voice over an unfamiliar new neighbor's quieter, less publicly amplified truth. I accepted every single apology genuinely, understanding fully how easily manufactured confidence can outshine honest, unamplified truth-telling. Walt, present at the dinner despite his earlier resignation from the board, told me privately he'd learned an important lesson about speaking up earlier rather than waiting for overwhelming evidence to force accountability naturally on its own. I saw red flags for years, he admitted quietly. I should have said something the very first time, not the 15th time it happened. Marissa, still living out of state, sent a card rather than attending in person herself, writing simply that she hoped the trail brought our family the same peace her father had once genuinely intended when he first bought that land decades earlier, before her mother's own ambitions eventually corrupted his original, simpler community vision entirely and completely over time. I read that short card twice, struck deeply by how much genuine grief still lived underneath everything Deborah had done to everyone involved. Her husband's original intentions, however informally expressed at the time, seemed genuinely sincere, even if his widow had spent years weaponizing a vague verbal promise into forged documents, financial fraud, and a full year of sustained harassment against my family. Theo and Ellie, largely oblivious to most of the underlying legal complexity, simply enjoyed having neighborhood friends over again like before, riding bikes freely past the Ridgeline entrance without a single unkind word from anyone passing by. Watching them laugh together in our own driveway felt like the clearest, simplest possible measure of everything we'd actually fought so hard for. Priya and I eventually decided to formally reopen the trail ourselves, voluntarily, as a genuine courtesy again, exactly as it had originally been for years before Deborah ever tried claiming legal ownership over it falsely. This time, though, we posted our own clear signage explicitly stating it remained private land, accessed only ever through our direct personal permission. Carol helped organize a small volunteer trail cleanup day for the whole neighborhood, genuinely maintaining the path with real gravel, real benches, and real itemized invoices this time around, funded through voluntary neighbor contributions with full transparent accounting for everyone to see. Nothing like the opaque, unaccountable maintenance fund Deborah had quietly drained for years under false pretenses. Renata, our original surveyor, later told me she'd fielded several calls from other regional HOAs after our case became locally notorious, asking her to proactively verify actual recorded easements before advertising any community amenities in future developments. A small but genuinely meaningful ripple effect from what had started as our own private, exhausting nightmare entirely and unexpectedly. Denise mentioned our case had even been referenced informally in a state real estate continuing education seminar about disclosure liability recently, cited as a cautionary example of what happens when agents advertise unverified amenities purely to inflate commissions, without ever confirming underlying legal rights actually existed the way they publicly, confidently claimed they did. I felt an unexpected sense of genuine purpose learning that our exhausting, deeply personal fight had potentially prevented other families somewhere else from experiencing exactly what we had gone through, simply because a licensing seminar somewhere now used forged trail easements and inflated home premiums as a concrete, real-world cautionary example for future agents entering the profession. Deborah, meanwhile, relocated out of Ridgeline Hollow entirely within 6 months of her sentencing, selling her own home at a noticeably reduced price given the well-documented public scandal surrounding her name locally by then. Nobody in the neighborhood seemed to know, or particularly care, exactly where she moved after that quiet, unceremonious final departure from the community. Cody completed his community service hours working with a local conservation group restoring an unrelated public trail elsewhere in the county, an assignment Denise noted with quiet satisfaction, as oddly appropriate given everything that had happened, though she was careful to add she genuinely hoped it represented real rehabilitation rather than mere ironic coincidence in his case. Walt, elected formally to a permanent HOA board seat during the next election cycle, pushed through new bylaws requiring independent third-party audits every 2 years, mandatory itemized invoices for all maintenance funds collected, and a formal prohibition against board members personally profiting from real estate transactions involving disputed HOA-adjacent property claims going forward. Those new bylaws passed unanimously without a single dissenting vote. A stark contrast to the unquestioning deference Deborah had commanded for nearly 2 decades beforehand without real challenge. Carol, now permanently interim president by popular demand, told me the entire board finally felt like genuine public service again, rather than one dominant personality controlling every conversation through sheer force of confidence alone. A year after the criminal conviction was finalized, our own family finally felt fully settled again completely, the trail quietly maintained by volunteers. The gate rarely even needed anymore since neighbors simply respected the clearly posted boundaries voluntarily now. Theo and Ellie hiked it regularly with friends now. The exact simple joy we'd originally hoped this land might offer everyone in the first place. Priya, reflecting on the whole ordeal one quiet evening, said something that stuck with me long afterward and still does today. She spent years building her power on other people's trust and never checking anything herself carefully. And it only took people finally checking things themselves to take it all back down completely. I couldn't have said it better myself. Honestly, I thought often about how close this all came to a very different ending. If Renata hadn't caught that mismatched meets and bounds description, if Marissa hadn't reached out, if Walt hadn't finally spoken honestly, if Greg hadn't wanted to protect his own reputation. Accountability, I realized slowly, often depends on several quiet people finally choosing courage together, one at a time. Denise told me our case remained one of the more satisfying resolutions of her entire career, specifically because justice arrived through methodical, patient evidence gathering rather than public shouting matches or viral outrage alone, even though both had certainly occurred loudly along the way before the quieter, more careful truth eventually won out completely and permanently in the end. Looking back at that very first HOA sign Deborah installed claiming my private trail as community property, I recognized now it wasn't really about a trail at all. Not fundamentally. It was about control, profit, and a carefully cultivated reputation built entirely on nobody ever bothering to simply check the actual, publicly available county records themselves. Ever. For years, the state's final restitution order required Deborah to pay the remaining balance toward affected homeowners over a structured payment plan, given her frozen assets alone hadn't fully covered the full $50,000 collective harm once legal fees and administrative costs were properly accounted for across everyone involved in the final settlement distribution process eventually. Carol received her portion of restitution 9 months after the settlement was finalized, finally recovering a meaningful chunk of the premium she'd unknowingly overpaid years earlier, though she told me the actual money mattered less than simply having official, undeniable confirmation that she hadn't imagined or misunderstood the fraud that had actually occurred to her personally. 2 other affected homeowners, initially hesitant to join Carol's coordinated claim out of lingering loyalty to Deborah, eventually filed supplemental claims once they saw the first restitution payments processing successfully, expanding the total number of formally compensated households to 8 rather than the original 6 explicitly named earlier in our filed case. I received word through Denise that the state licensing board had also flagged 2 other agents in neighboring counties for similar unverified amenity claims of their own, prompted directly by increased scrutiny following our case's growing publicity, suggesting Deborah's specific pattern of behavior, while unusually brazen and bold, wasn't entirely unique within the broader regional real estate industry. Renata's small business, ironically enough, grew steadily busier following our case's local notoriety spreading, with several homeowners associations across 3 separate counties proactively hiring her firm to verify existing easement claims before any further marketing or advertising referencing shared trails, parks, or recreational access features moving forward into future development phases. I ran into Greg Hutchins at a hardware store nearly a year after everything had settled down, and he thanked me, somewhat awkwardly, for not pursuing any additional claim against his own business. Despite his initial involvement with Deborah's development plans, acknowledging he should have verified the underlying property rights himself before entertaining any serious negotiation with her. Lesson learned, I guess, Greg said simply, shaking my hand firmly before leaving the store. I appreciated that he took genuine accountability, however belatedly, rather than deflecting entirely the way Deborah had for so long throughout everything. Not everyone involved in this whole mess turned out to be malicious. Some, like Greg, were simply careless in ways that eventually cost them real credibility. Marissa visited Ridgeline Hollow once quietly, nearly 2 years after her mother's sentencing was handed down, walking the trail alone early one morning before anyone else in the neighborhood was even awake yet. She left a small handwritten note tucked into our mailbox afterward, thanking us for maintaining the land her father had genuinely loved, unlike how her mother eventually came to treat it. I never responded to that note directly myself, unsure exactly what to say in return. But Priya suggested we simply leave the gate unlocked that particular week as a quiet gesture, letting Marissa know she remained genuinely welcome to walk her father's old trail anytime she wanted, entirely separate from anything her mother had ever done to hurt us. Deborah, from what limited information eventually reached us through distant secondhand community gossip, apparently moved to a small coastal town several hours away from Ridgeline Hollow, working an unrelated, administrative job entirely unconnected to real estate now. Her professional license permanently revoked and her once considerable local reputation completely, irreversibly destroyed by her own choices and actions. I felt no particular urge to track her further or seek any additional information about her new life elsewhere. The trail was legally, permanently mine now. The forgery was formally, publicly exposed for good. The affected homeowners had received meaningful restitution finally. Justice, in whatever imperfect form it actually took in the end, had genuinely and thoroughly run its full, complete course, looking back across the entire multi-year ordeal. From that very first friendly maintenance request to a felony conviction and beyond, I recognized the story wasn't really about a Karen versus one stubborn homeowner refusing to compromise at all. It was about an entire community slowly, painfully learning the real, lasting cost of blind trust placed in confident, unverified authority. Carol eventually became something of an informal watchdog within the new HOA leadership structure, regularly reminding board meetings to request documentation before accepting any claim at face value going forward, a habit she developed directly from watching how thoroughly Deborah had exploited everyone's collective unwillingness to simply ask basic, reasonable questions for years on end. Walt, still serving actively on the board, told me during one of our occasional coffee catch-ups that the new transparency requirements had actually made HOA meetings noticeably shorter and less contentious overall now, since disputes rarely escalated anymore once residents trusted that documentation, rather than personality or sheer volume. ultimately determined every community decision made going forward. Theo, now a teenager himself, occasionally brought friends from Ridgeline Hollow over to fish at the creek along the trail on weekends, something that would have been genuinely unthinkable during the worst months of our conflict with Deborah, when even walking near the subdivision entrance invited hostile stares and whispered accusations from strangers who barely even knew our family at all. Ellie, now in middle school, once wrote a school essay about the whole experience, carefully anonymized for privacy, focusing on the importance of standing firm against unfair authority even when it feels overwhelming and isolating at the time. Her teacher, unaware of the real story behind it, praised the essay warmly as remarkably mature and thoughtfully argued for someone her age. Priya and I occasionally reflected together on how differently everything might have unfolded if we'd simply caved to Deborah's very first friendly-sounding request to help maintain the trail.
Formally through the HOA, effectively surrendering our clear private ownership before any real dispute even properly began in the first place, years earlier than it eventually actually did unfold.
Denise, reflecting on the case's final conclusion during our last formal meeting together, said she genuinely hoped it served as a reminder that persistent, methodical documentation eventually outlasts confident bluster and public intimidation, no matter how overwhelming the pressure feels during the actual, exhausting months spent living directly through that uncertainty personally, day after day. I thanked Denise sincerely for her patience throughout nearly 2 full years of litigation, forensic examination, depositions, and settlement negotiations, acknowledging that without her methodical approach and genuine belief in our case from the very beginning, we likely wouldn't have achieved anywhere near this level of complete, thorough, and lasting accountability for everyone involved. The Ridgeline Hollow HOA, under Carol and Walt's continued steady leadership, eventually used part of the restitution funds to formally install proper signage acknowledging the trail as privately owned by our family, accessible only through our voluntary permission, replacing every remaining trace of Deborah's original false community ownership claims completely and permanently at long last. That new signage felt like a small but meaningful symbolic closure to everything. A physical, visible acknowledgement replacing the fraudulent one that had started this entire painful chapter of our lives nearly 2 years earlier. Standing now at the very same trailhead where Deborah's original forged claim had once confidently, falsely proclaimed something entirely untrue. I sometimes still think back to that very first friendly note Deborah sent, asking innocently if the HOA could simply help maintain the trail with a few benches and some gravel. Such a small, reasonable-sounding request on its surface. Yet it carried within it the hidden seed of everything that eventually unfolded across the following 2 exhausting, grueling years of our lives. Priya reminded me regularly during the hardest, darkest months that boundaries, even quiet, unassuming ones like an old dirt trail through private woods, matter enormously in the end, and that protecting them isn't unreasonable stubbornness but simple, necessary self-respect, regardless of how loudly or confidently someone else insists otherwise through sheer social pressure and manufactured community consensus. Looking back now, the twists along the way, the missing original document, the spliced font kerning, the estranged daughter's crucial testimony, the builder's development scheme, the unauthorized bank transfer, the handwriting match to Deborah's own drafting notes. Each one revealed a woman far more calculating and self-interested than her carefully cultivated public persona had ever suggested to anyone. I've come to believe most Karen stories people share casually online capture only the loud, dramatic surface moments, the blocked driveways and screaming matches caught on camera, without ever showing the months of patient documentation, forensic verification, and quiet legal persistence actually required underneath to transform a bully's false confidence into genuine, provable, lasting accountability. Our own case took nearly 2 full years from that first friendly-sounding maintenance request to Deborah's final felony sentencing, filled with forged documents, frozen assets, a $50,000 collective neighborhood loss, a shuttered brokerage, a permanently revoked real estate license, and ultimately, a fully restored, undisputed, legally protected private trail through our own quiet forest land. Standing at the overlook at Hawk Ridge recently on a clear afternoon, watching Theo and Ellie skip stones across the creek below with their neighborhood friends laughing loudly, I felt genuinely, completely at peace for the first time since this entire ordeal began years earlier. The forest finally, truly ours again, exactly as it always should have remained the whole time. Priya joined me at the overlook that same afternoon, remarking quietly that the whole exhausting fight, however painful it had been, had ultimately strengthened something genuinely valuable in our own family. A shared resilience and quiet confidence in standing firm against unfair pressure. Something she hoped Theo and Ellie carried forward long into their own adult lives eventually and completely. I agreed completely with her, though I told her I sincerely hoped neither of our kids ever actually needed to apply that particular lesson themselves later in life, since few experiences test a family's patience and resolve quite like nearly 2 years of sustained public harassment, forged documents, and community-wide manipulation orchestrated entirely by one confidently entitled HOA president. Carol texted me recently, mentioning the new HOA leadership was considering formally renaming the community clubhouse's small reading room after Walt himself, in recognition of his willingness to finally speak honestly when it mattered most, even at real personal and social cost within a community he genuinely, deeply cared about for decades of his life. I thought that was a fitting, quiet tribute for him, since Walt's simple willingness to give an honest sworn statement, when it would have been far easier and safer to stay silent instead, ultimately became one of the pivotal turning points that helped transform our case from one family's private grievance into genuine, lasting community accountability for everyone. Denise mentioned, during our very last conversation before formally closing our case file for good, that she occasionally still receives calls from other homeowners nationwide who found our case referenced in a real estate law blog online, asking for guidance on their own disputed HOA easement claims inspired directly by how thoroughly ours had eventually resolved itself. I felt a quiet sense of purpose knowing our exhausting, deeply personal fight had potentially helped other families elsewhere recognize the early warning signs Deborah had displayed from the very beginning of everything, the vague verbal promises, the missing paperwork, the confident insistence that questioning authority itself was somehow unreasonable or unnecessarily divisive to bring up. Then, almost exactly 2 years to the day after Deborah's original friendly maintenance note first arrived, Priya and I received an unexpected certified letter, forwarded through Denise's office, informing us that Deborah had filed a formal appeal challenging both her criminal conviction and the civil restitution order, citing newly discovered evidence she claimed proved her innocence. Denise called immediately once she reviewed the appeal filing herself, her voice carrying genuine surprise rather than her usual calm professional confidence. Deborah's new attorney was arguing that Dr. Petrov's forensic handwriting analysis had relied on an improperly authenticated comparison sample, potentially undermining the single most damning piece of evidence in our entire case against her. My stomach dropped reading the appeal summary carefully. After everything we'd been through, the depositions, the settlement, the restitution payments already partially distributed to affected homeowners, the possibility that a technical, evidentiary challenge could unravel 2 full years of hard-won accountability felt almost unbearable to contemplate, especially with Theo and Ellie finally, genuinely at peace again. Denise explained calmly that appeals citing evidentiary technicalities rarely succeeded once a defendant had already formally pleaded guilty under oath in open court, since Deborah's own sworn courtroom admission existed independently of Dr. Petrov's forensic report entirely on its own. Still, she couldn't guarantee the appellate court would dismiss the challenge quickly without holding a formal hearing first. I spent that entire night unable to sleep at all, replaying every piece of evidence in my mind over and over, wondering if some overlooked technicality might genuinely allow Deborah to escape. Consequences after everything her forged document and manipulative campaign had cost my family, our neighbors, and an entire community's collective trust over 2 exhausting years of struggle. Priya, characteristically more measured than me during moments of crisis, reminded me calmly that even if the criminal conviction faced some technical challenge on appeal, the independent forensic accountant's financial records, the MLS retraction, Marissa's testimony, and Greg's development disclosure all existed entirely separate from Dr. Petrov's specific handwriting methodology being challenged now on appeal. Denise filed a formal response within the required legal window, methodically demonstrating that Dr. Petrov's comparison samples had actually been sourced directly from HOA meeting minutes Deborah herself had authenticated under oath during her own prior deposition testimony, making the improper authentication argument considerably weaker than Deborah's new attorney apparently realized when he originally filed it. The appellate court scheduled a formal hearing for the following month, requiring Dr. Petrov to testify again regarding her exact methodology and sample sourcing, a prospect that unsettled me deeply. Despite Denise's calm reassurance that our underlying case remained fundamentally strong regardless of this particular narrow technical challenge Deborah's new legal team had raised on appeal. In preparing for the hearing, Dr. Petrov discovered something neither she nor Denise had previously emphasized clearly enough in the original trial. The handwritten draft notes Marissa had photographed included a distinctive letter formation, a specific looping style in the lowercase g, that matched Deborah's handwriting across 17 separate documents spanning nearly an entire decade. This detail, while technically already part of the original forensic report, hadn't been highlighted specifically enough during the initial trial proceedings, since Deborah's guilty plea had made extensive handwriting testimony largely unnecessary at the time. Now, facing renewed scrutiny on appeal, Dr. Petrov prepared a far more detailed, visually compelling presentation for the appellate hearing itself. At the hearing, Dr. Petrov walked the appellate judges through the 17-document comparison methodically and carefully, projecting side-by-side enlarged images of the distinctive looping G formation across meeting minutes, personal notes, and the forged draft language itself, demonstrating a consistency that Deborah's new attorney struggled visibly to meaningfully challenge or explain away credibly. Deborah's attorney attempted to argue that handwriting analysis remained inherently subjective and unreliable as forensic evidence generally speaking. A broad argument the appellate judges seemed visibly skeptical of, particularly given Deborah's own sworn guilty plea had already independently acknowledged fabricating the document. Regardless of whatever specific methodology initially helped establish that underlying fact originally. After a tense 2-hour hearing session, the appellate panel took the matter under advisement, promising a written ruling within 30 days of the hearing's conclusion. Denise felt cautiously optimistic afterward, noting the judge's visible skepticism toward Deborah's core argument, but reminded me that appellate outcomes always carry genuine uncertainty regardless of how strong any particular case seemed beforehand to us. Those 30 days felt agonizingly long to get through. Priya and I tried maintaining normal routines for Theo and Ellie's sake throughout, but the underlying tension colored everything quietly in the background of daily life. A reminder that even seemingly resolved conflicts could resurface unexpectedly, threatening hard-won accountability years after we genuinely believed our exhausting ordeal had finally concluded completely for good. Then, exactly 28 days after the hearing concluded, Denise called with the final ruling. The appellate court had unanimously rejected Deborah's appeal outright, affirming both the original criminal conviction and civil restitution order in full, specifically citing her own sworn guilty plea as independently sufficient regardless of any technical forensic methodology challenge raised afterward on appeal. I felt an overwhelming wave of relief hearing that final news, followed almost immediately by a strange, quiet exhaustion settling over me, as if my body had finally allowed itself to fully process nearly 2.5 years of sustained legal conflict only once every possible avenue for Deborah's continued challenge had been formally, permanently closed for good. Denise mentioned the appellate ruling included unusually direct language criticizing the appeal as a transparent attempt to relitigate settled facts through procedural technicality rather than genuine legal merit.
A rare judicial rebuke that effectively foreclosed any realistic possibility of Deborah pursuing further challenges through additional appeals moving forward from this point onward permanently.
Carol texted congratulations within hours of the ruling becoming public record, having apparently heard through Walt's continued board connections almost immediately after it was announced. The broader Ridgeline Hollow community, still occasionally discussing our case informally among themselves, seemed genuinely relieved that the accountability they'd witnessed unfold over 2 years remained fully, permanently intact and undisturbed by the appeal. Marissa sent a brief message as well shortly after, simply saying she was glad it was finally, truly over now for good, mentioning she'd started therapy processing her complicated relationship with her mother, something she said she probably should have started years earlier, long before any of this trail dispute or forgery scandal had ever even begun in the first place. I told Marissa I genuinely hoped she found real peace with everything eventually, separate entirely from whatever consequences her mother continued facing legally. Her courage in coming forward, despite obvious personal cost and family strain throughout, had fundamentally shaped our case's ultimate outcome, and I made absolutely sure she knew how deeply, genuinely grateful I remained for that courage. With the appeal now formally, permanently resolved once and for all, the remaining restitution payments to affected homeowners resumed their original scheduled timeline smoothly, with Carol and the 7 other affected households receiving their final distributions within the following 3 months, closing out the financial component of this entire exhausting saga completely and definitively for everyone involved. Denise closed our case file formally shortly afterward, remarking during our final call together that few cases she'd handled across her entire career had traveled quite this far. From a simple, friendly-sounding maintenance request to a felony forgery conviction, an unsuccessful appeal, and a $50,000 collective community financial reckoning altogether, start to finish. I asked Denise what she thought the single most important lesson from our case actually was, beyond the specific forged document or financial fraud details themselves. She said simply that authority without verification is just performance, essentially, and that real accountability almost always requires someone willing to keep asking basic, uncomfortable questions long after everyone else stops asking entirely. Reflecting on her answer afterward, I realized that described nearly every pivotal moment in our entire case precisely and clearly. Renata questioning the metes and bounds description, Walt questioning the missing original document, Carol questioning the maintenance fund invoices, Marissa questioning her mother's handwriting, Greg questioning his own development involvement once the facts finally emerged clearly to him. None of those individual moments alone would have been sufficient to fully expose Deborah's forgery and fraud on their own. But together, accumulated patiently over nearly 2.5 exhausting years, they created an evidentiary foundation strong enough to withstand not just an initial trial, but a determined appellate challenge specifically designed to unravel it afterward and fail. Priya and I eventually stopped actively discussing the case in our daily conversation together. The exhausting chapter finally, genuinely behind us now completely and for good. Theo, now well into his teenage years, occasionally brought up the story casually with new friends, treating it almost like distant family folklore rather than the harrowing lived experience it once actually genuinely was for our whole family. Ellie, now approaching high school herself, mentioned once that she wanted to study environmental law someday soon. Partly inspired, she admitted somewhat shyly, by watching Denise navigate our complicated case with such calm, methodical persistence across nearly 3 exhausting years of forged documents, depositions, settlements, and ultimately, a fully vindicated appellate ruling in our favor. I felt genuinely moved hearing that from her, recognizing that even amid everything difficult our family endured together, something meaningful and constructive had quietly taken root in our own children's developing sense of justice, patience, and quiet, principled persistence against unfair pressure. However overwhelming or socially isolating that pressure initially felt to us at the time, the trail itself, now formally, permanently ours beyond any possible future dispute at all, continues serving its original simple purpose faithfully. A quiet forest path down to a peaceful creek and a scenic overlook, walked occasionally by neighbors with genuine permission granted, maintained transparently through voluntary community contribution, exactly as it always should have remained from the very start. Standing there recently on a quiet autumn afternoon, watching golden light filter gently through the trees along that same familiar path we knew so well, I found myself thinking less about Deborah Voss specifically, and more about how ordinary, quiet persistence, patient documentation, and a genuine willingness to simply keep asking questions had ultimately outlasted her manufactured confidence entirely and completely. Denise, during our very last conversation before formally closing the file permanently for good, mentioned she'd occasionally used our case anonymously as a teaching example for younger attorneys joining her firm, illustrating how methodical, Patient evidence gathering consistently outperforms reactive emotional responses, even when facing sustained public pressure, intimidation, and manufactured community hostility along the way. I asked her, half joking at the time, whether she thought Deborah ever genuinely understood the actual scale of harm her forged document and manipulative campaign ultimately caused everyone involved, beyond simply resenting getting caught and formally punished for it. Denise paused thoughtfully before admitting she honestly didn't know, and perhaps never fully would, and that some people simply never truly do understand that. That lingering uncertainty didn't bother me particularly. I found I'd stopped needing Deborah's genuine remorse or understanding for our own family's sense of closure and peace to feel complete and real to us. Her formal, sworn guilty plea, the permanent forensic record, and the fully vindicated appellate ruling provided sufficient, tangible, lasting accountability regardless of her private feelings about any of it. Carol, still serving as HOA president 2 full years after Deborah's departure from the community, told me recently the whole community felt fundamentally different now, less driven by any single dominant personality's confident narrative, more genuinely collaborative, transparent, and accountable across every board decision, financial disclosure, and community claim made publicly moving forward from that point onward. Walt, now in his mid-70s and still active, mentioned during our last coffee catch-up that he finally felt at genuine peace with his own earlier hesitation to speak up sooner, having ultimately found the courage when it mattered most in the end, and having watched that courage meaningfully contribute to real, lasting, permanent accountability within a community he genuinely loved for decades of his life. I've thought often, across these past few years since everything settled, about how differently everything might have unfolded if I'd simply avoided confrontation entirely back when Deborah first suggested the HOA help maintain our trail informally, quietly surrendering informal access without ever recognizing it as the opening move in a much longer, calculated campaign against us. Priya reminded me recently that avoiding that initial confrontation would have simply delayed the inevitable reckoning, not prevented it entirely from happening eventually, since Deborah's underlying pattern of manipulation, forgery, and financial self-interest would likely have eventually surfaced regardless of our choices, probably causing even greater cumulative harm the longer it remained undiscovered and unaddressed by anyone at all. That perspective offered me genuine comfort during moments of lingering doubt about whether we'd handled everything correctly throughout those exhausting years of struggle. Standing firm from the very beginning, however isolating and difficult it initially felt at the time, ultimately protected not just our own family's interests, but an entire community's long-term financial and social well-being going forward. The forensic accountant who'd originally traced the missing maintenance funds later told Denise, during an unrelated professional conference she attended, that our case had become something of a minor legend among regional forensic accountants, specifically cited informally as an example of how thoroughly patient financial tracing could expose even carefully concealed embezzlement schemes hidden within trusted institutions.
DR. Similarly, mentioned our case occasionally appeared in forensic document examination training materials now used in the field, specifically highlighting the distinctive looping G handwriting match as a clear, compelling example of how consistent personal writing habits can definitively establish authorship even when someone attempts deliberately disguising or denying their own handwriting involvement in a forgery.
I felt a quiet sense of satisfaction learning our exhausting personal ordeal had inadvertently contributed something genuinely useful to broader professional knowledge across forensic accounting, document examination, and real estate law circles more generally, transforming an intensely painful, isolating family experience into something with meaningful, lasting value extending well beyond our own immediate situation and family. Renata, still occasionally consulting for regional HOAs verifying disputed easement claims of their own, mentioned recently that increased scrutiny following our case had already prevented at least 2 other similar fraudulent trail access claims from ever reaching the same destructive scale ours eventually did, with homeowners associations catching discrepancies early through proactive, independent verification instead of blind trust. That news brought me genuine satisfaction to hear, knowing our painful, exhausting journey had potentially spared other families the same nearly 3 years of sustained harassment, forged documents, financial fraud, and community-wide manipulation we'd personally endured, simply because other HOAs now proactively verified claims before ever advertising unearned amenities publicly to prospective, unsuspecting buyers. Theo, now 17 and preparing for college applications this year, recently asked me directly what I'd actually learned from the entire multi-year ordeal, beyond the obvious legal and financial lessons already discussed extensively within our own family over the preceding years since everything had originally painfully begun with one friendly-sounding request from Deborah. I told him honestly and without hesitation that I'd learned confidence and truth aren't actually the same thing, no matter how convincingly someone presents themselves publicly to a crowd, and that real accountability almost always requires patient, methodical people willing to keep quietly documenting reality long after louder, more confident voices insist that reality doesn't actually matter at all. Ellie, now 16 years old, added her own thoughtful perspective during that same conversation, mentioning she'd learned that standing firm against unfair pressure doesn't require being loud or aggressive yourself in return, just consistently honest and patient over time. A lesson she said she'd already applied successfully in her own smaller conflicts with friends and classmates over recent years at school. Priya, listening quietly to both our kids reflecting so thoughtfully on lessons learned from an ordeal that had once threatened to overwhelm our entire family completely, told me afterward she felt genuinely proud watching something so painful ultimately transform into something meaningfully constructive within both Theo and Ellie's developing characters and personal worldviews going forward. I agreed completely with her assessment, recognizing that while I'd never wish those nearly 3 exhausting years on any other family, watching our own children process everything with such genuine maturity, patience, and quiet moral clarity felt like an unexpected, genuinely meaningful silver lining emerging from what had otherwise been an incredibly difficult, prolonged ordeal for all of us. Standing at the Hawk Ridge overlook recently on a quiet Sunday morning, watching Theo and Ellie hike ahead of us with their own friends, laughing freely without a single trace of the old tension that once colored every walk near the Ridgeline Hollow entrance. I felt genuinely, completely at peace with everything that had happened to our family over the years. Priya joined me there quietly, taking my hand gently, both of us watching our children disappear briefly around a bend in the trail ahead before reappearing moments later, still laughing together, entirely unaware of just how much quiet legal battle, forensic investigation, and patient documentation had ultimately secured this simple, peaceful moment for them to enjoy freely. "We did the right thing," Priya said softly beside me. Not really as a question, more as a quiet confirmation of something we'd both already known deeply for years now. I nodded, genuinely agreeing completely with her. Watching golden autumn light filter gently through the same trees Deborah had once so aggressively, fraudulently claimed as her own property entirely. The trail remains exactly what it always should have been from the very beginning. A quiet, peaceful path through private forest, walked with genuine permission and mutual respect between neighbors, transparently maintained through voluntary community contribution, entirely free from forged documents, financial fraud, manufactured community hostility, or any single individual's unchecked, unearned authority over land they never actually owned at all. Deborah Voss, wherever she eventually settled after her professional and reputational collapse played out publicly, remains permanently, formally, publicly recorded as a convicted felon on paper, her real estate license permanently revoked for good, her manipulative campaign against my family thoroughly, comprehensively exposed and documented through independent forensic examination, sworn testimony, and an unsuccessful, thoroughly rejected appellate challenge. Carol continues leading the Ridgeline Hollow HOA with genuine transparency and care. Walt continues serving thoughtfully on its board. Marissa continues slowly rebuilding her own independent life separate from her mother's complicated legacy. And Greg continues running his construction business with a renewed personal commitment to verifying underlying property rights before any future development deals he considers. Our own family, Priya, Theo, Ellie, and I, continue living exactly the quiet, peaceful life we originally sought when we first bought this forested land nearly 15 years ago now. The trail finally, permanently secure. Our home finally, genuinely peaceful. Our community finally, meaningfully transparent and accountable after everything we'd collectively endured together over the years. I still occasionally walk that trail alone early in the mornings, coffee in hand, remembering every single twist and turn of the exhausting multi-year battle it took to formally, permanently secure something that had always, legally, rightfully belonged to our family from the very beginning, long before Deborah Voss ever tried claiming otherwise through forged documents and lies. Each time I reached the overlook at Hawk Ridge on those quiet mornings, watching morning mist slowly clear from the creek below, I feel a quiet, genuine gratitude for Renata's careful survey work, Walt's eventual courage, Carol's persistent questions, Marissa's difficult testimony, Greg's honest disclosure, Dr. Petrov's meticulous forensic analysis, and Denise's patient, methodical legal persistence throughout everything. Without any single one of those people's individual contributions along the way, our case likely wouldn't have achieved anywhere near this level of complete, lasting, formally documented accountability. A reminder that genuine justice rarely emerges from one dramatic confrontation alone, but rather from many smaller, patient, quietly courageous contributions accumulated steadily over considerable time and effort. The $50,000 collective financial harm suffered by our neighbors, once fully restituted through Deborah's frozen assets and structured payment plan, ultimately became just one measurable component within a much larger story about unchecked authority, manufactured community trust, forged documents, and the quiet, patient courage eventually required to expose it all thoroughly and completely in the end. I think, ultimately, That's the real lesson from everything our family endured across nearly 3 exhausting years of struggle. That entitlement dressed convincingly as community leadership can cause genuine, measurable, lasting harm. But that patient documentation, honest testimony, and quiet persistence can eventually, thoroughly, permanently dismantle even the most confidently constructed fraudulent narrative in the world. Deborah Voss built her entire community reputation and real estate business on a forged document and a dead husband's vague verbal promise, weaponizing both against my family for nearly a year before the truth finally, methodically caught up with her completely, exposing forgery, embezzlement, harassment, and years of quietly inflated home sale premiums across an entire trusting neighborhood. In the end, closing that trail behind a simple locked gate didn't just protect my own family's legal rights that day. It inadvertently triggered a chain of forensic investigation, sworn testimony, and patient legal persistence that ultimately restored genuine transparency, accountability, and $50,000 in rightful restitution to an entire deceived, manipulated community that deserved better all along. Deborah's own carefully constructed empire of forged paperwork, inflated commissions, and manufactured community loyalty collapsed entirely under the sheer weight of patient documentation and honest testimony, proving that even the most confidently entitled authority eventually answers to simple, verifiable, publicly available facts, however long it genuinely takes for the truth to fully expose them completely. Our trail remains ours, legally, permanently, undisputedly, walked freely now by our own children and genuinely welcomed neighbors alike. Exactly as it always should have been from the very beginning. Long before one entitled HOA president ever tried claiming otherwise through forged documents and years of manufactured public hostility directed squarely against our entire family. Standing here now, years removed from that first friendly-sounding maintenance request that started it all, I recognize the entire ordeal taught our family something invaluable about patience, documentation, and quiet, principled persistence against unfair authority. Lessons I genuinely hope our own children carry forward thoughtfully into whatever challenges their own future lives eventually bring them down the road. Priya, Theo, Ellie, and I continue walking this trail together regularly now, entirely at peace with everything, genuinely grateful for Renata, Walt, Carol, Marissa, Greg, Dr. Petrov, and Denise, each of whom contributed essential, courageous pieces toward the complete, lasting accountability our family and our entire community ultimately, thoroughly, rightfully achieved together over these years. Deborah Voss remains a convicted felon to this day, permanently stripped of her real estate license for good, publicly, formally, and thoroughly held accountable for forging a document, embezzling community funds, and inflating her neighbors' home values through years of fraud, while our family's forest trail remains exactly, finally, permanently what it always should have been, genuinely, undisputedly ours alone. The gate stands quietly at the trailhead now, rarely locked, rarely even needed anymore, a simple, peaceful symbol of hard-won, thoroughly documented, permanently secured truth over manufactured confidence, entitlement, and forgery, exactly the quiet, genuine, undisputed peace our family originally sought when we first bought this forested land so many years ago together.